In this session, we'll explore the life and work of the greatest composer of the Baroque period of music, and to many critics and fans, the greatest composer of all. His name was Johann Sebastian Bach, and he was one of the most prolific geniuses that ever lived, both in his professional and private life. He wrote over 1,000 musical pieces and still found time to father 20 children. And he did this while fulfilling very arduous duties as a musician, conductor, and teacher. Bach is widely accepted as the master of the Baroque style, a period of music that lasted from about 1600 to 1750, the year of his death. Baroque music is very complex and dramatic. It's characterized by its rich harmonies, its ornateness, and its broad theatrical concepts. By the time Bach was writing, Baroque had begun to fade in popularity and was considered old-fashioned in some circles. Yet he brought Baroque to its culmination, finishing off the era with the best music of the genre. He brought together all the basic forms and styles of the preceding generation, synthesized them, and perfected them. In doing so, he took certain elements of Baroque music to their greatest heights. This included the use of counterpoint, the playing of more than one melody at the same time, and the use of fugues, where different instruments repeat the same melody. Bach wrote both religious and secular music, and he wrote both instrumental and choral music. He worked in every musical form of the 18th century, with the exception of opera. In spite of his brilliant compositions, Bach was known in his own time more for his playing than his composing. He was a superb organist who dazzled people with his dexterity with the keyboard and foot pedals. He even occasionally used a stick in his mouth to reach particular notes. But spellbinding as his performances were, in the century that followed him, people began to recognize the magnificence of his compositions, and his reputation has grown steadily until he now ranks among the top 5 on almost any list of great composers. It would seem that such greatness was clearly his destiny from the beginning. Bach was born into a family that had for centuries produced musical virtuosos. In all, 76 of his male relatives were musicians. When Bach was 50 years old, he researched and wrote a genealogy on his unique family entitled Origin of the Musical Bach Family. In that work, he traced his ancestry back to a great-great-grandfather who was a baker and used to take a lute to the mill so he could play while he was grinding grain. Bach's amused comment on this was, "What a pretty noise they must have made together." However, he learnt to keep time, and this apparently was the beginning of music in our family. It was a family of which Bach and all the other Bachs was deeply proud. Bach himself was born March 21, 1685, in Eisenach, Germany. Throughout his life, he never traveled far from his hometown. He was trained as a boy by his father, Johann Ambrosia, who taught him to play the violin. His mother, Elizabeth, read to him from the Bible. Johann Sebastian Bach was a devout Lutheran, and religion played an important role throughout his life and in his music. By the time Bach was 9, both his parents had died, and he went to live with his brother, another Johann, this time a Johann Christoph. Untangling the Johanns in the Bach family tree is a challenging task that relies on the use of nicknames. There were 53 relatives named Johann, and Bach himself named 5 of his sons Johann, and 2 of his daughters Johanna. Bach's brother was an organist who had trained under the famous keyboard composer Johann Pachelbel. He gave Johann his first lessons on the instrument, as well as on the clavichord and the harpsichord. Johann stayed with him for 5 years, developing skills on the keyboard and studying composition on his own. He managed this simply by using the works of older composers as models. By the time he was only 15, Bach was able to support himself by singing and playing the organ in nearby towns he could walk to. Johann Bach is famous for his walking. He once walked 200 miles just to hear a favorite organist play, and he regularly walked to Hamburg and back, a distance of 50 kilometers each way. There's a story about how on his return from one of these journeys, exhausted and penniless, he stopped outside an inn to rest. Someone threw 2 herring heads onto the rubbish heap, and Bach picked them up to see if there was anything salvageable. Mysteriously, he found 1 coin in each head. Not only was he able to buy a solid meal, but he had enough money to make another, more comfortable trek to Hamburg a short time later. In 1703, when he was 18, Bach took a post as violinist in the orchestra of the city of Weimar, which was ruled by the Duke of Saxe-Weimar. After 6 months, he was also appointed organist in nearby Arnstadt, a position that delighted him because Arnstadt had just recently built an exquisite new organ. It is here that he began to develop his flamboyant playing style. It is also here that he composed his earliest surviving works for the organ. Bach spent 2 years in Arnstadt, but the harmony in his music was not reflected in his personal life. He argued with the singers and musicians who found his work difficult and who didn't come up to his personal standards. He also argued with his employers constantly about the limited scope of his duties. They, in turn, were very annoyed when he took one of his famous walking trips to a city featuring a popular organist and didn't return for 2.5 months. It didn't help when Bach got into a public scuffle with a group of students who were seeking revenge for an insult he'd made to one of them. Bach had called the young man a nanny-goat bassoonist because he'd made the bassoon sound like a goat. That evening, the student and 5 of his friends assaulted Bach, who pulled out a knife in self-defense. Although the fight was broken up before anyone was injured, the incident didn't do much for Bach's image or for the church, and eventually he was dismissed. These conflicts with authority would be a pattern in Bach's life. Almost every position he took resulted in personality clashes and fights with his superiors. He was one of the original difficult artists. In 1707, Bach married his first cousin, as was common in those days, and settled into a new position as organist in the city of Mühlhausen. His wife's name was Maria Barbara, and over the next 13 years, she would bear him 7 of his 20 children. One of the saddest moments of their lives was when their only twins died in infancy. Bach's second wife, Anna Magdalena, would bear the remaining 13. Bach's position in Mühlhausen got off to a bad start, not because of the authorities this time, but because of the public. The congregation in the church found his innovative music too difficult to understand, and he left in only a year. In that year, he brought compositions in to enlarge the choir library, tried to support more music in surrounding villages, and initiated a plan for rebuilding the organ. After he left, that building was completed, and he returned to help inaugurate it. After Mühlhausen, Bach returned to Weimar. He would remain in Weimar for 9 years, 9 very productive years, in which he wrote a series of cantatas, each to be performed on sequential Sundays. Bach worked in the court of the Duke of Saxe-Weimar during this time as court organist and chamber musician. Part of his duties were also to compose music for religious services, and so it was during this time that he wrote many of his cantatas and some of his finest organ pieces. Bach's music underwent a profound change during this period. He was influenced by Italian opera and by Italian concerto composers such as Antonio Vivaldi, and his musical techniques began to reflect this influence. Always short-tempered, Bach became angry in Weimar when he was passed up for a promotion to music director. He looked for another position, found one with Prince Leopold of Cothen, and asked to be relieved from his duties at Weimar. This led to an argument that so unnerved the Duke that he slapped Bach into prison for a month. The argument may have been provoked by the fact that the Duke was an enemy of Leopold's 2 nephews. Whatever provoked it, Bach's time in jail was not wasted. He wrote 46 pieces of music, some with his children in mind. When he was released, Bach moved to the city of Cothen, where he served as director of music for Prince Leopold. He remained there for 6 years, until 1723. Bach was required to write chiefly chamber and orchestral music, but the religious services at Leopold's court were simple and required little imagination. Instead, Bach devoted himself to composing non-religious instrumental music. During this time, his first wife, Maria Barbara, died unexpectedly, possibly of a heart attack. Bach suffered a severe depression for the first few months, but a year and a half later, he married his second wife, Anna Magdalena, daughter of a trumpeter and a singer and keyboard player herself. Anna Magdalena was a younger woman, joyful and energetic, and quite willing to take over the responsibility of raising Bach's children. He was so delighted with her that he wrote her a special poem for their wedding day that read, "Your servant, sweetest Madam Bride, joy be with you this morning. to see you in your flowery crown, and wedding day adorning, would fill with joy the sternest soul. What wonder, as I meet you, that my fond heart and loving lips o'erflow with song to greet you. Anna Magdalena would become a valuable partner in Bach's work, and helped so much with the copying of his compositions that eventually her handwriting was identical to his. She would also give him 13 more children. Anna always believed that her husband's work was sacred, and once said that she had come closer to God through his music than through all the sermons she'd heard in her lifetime. Bach was a devoted father, in spite of the immense amounts of time his work and composing required. He taught all his children music and wrote special compositions to help them exercise each finger and train their hands. Evenings at the Bach house were often lively musical affairs where everyone gathered together to play instruments and sing. Visitors reported that Bach almost always had one or two of the youngest children propped upon his lap. Although only 10 of the 20 Bach children lived to adulthood, 4 of them became famous composers in their own right. There were Wilhelm Friedmann, Carl Philipp Emanuel, Johann Christoph, and Johann Christian, the latter of whom became a good friend of Mozart's and is known today as the English Bach. Those who knew Bach say he was a congenial and modest man, in spite of the stubbornness and temper that seemed to plague his employers. He dressed in somber black clothes and wore a heavy gray wig in the typical elaborate style of the times, a wig that made his already large head seem even larger. His eyes were intense and narrow, probably from many years of poring over manuscripts. He was slightly rotund, not surprising since he had a great passion for food and beer. His greatest passion, however, was coffee, and he even wrote a cantata to it once, partially to tease his daughter Lieschen, who had reprimanded him for the large amounts he consumed. The cantata tells the story of a father Schlendrian, whose daughter Lieschen has a passion for coffee. The father tries to cure the daughter of her weakness, but she's finally victorious when she declares that she will never marry unless, in the words Bach wrote, her lover will promise to her in person and insert it in the marriage settlements that she will be allowed to make coffee as she pleases. The coffee cantata became famous throughout the country. Bach's other favorite pastime was smoking his pipe, and he composed a song about that too, a song that delighted his wife and which she often sung to him. It went, "Whenever in an hour of leisure, with Naster good my pipe I fill, and sit and smoke for rest or pleasure, sad pictures rise without my will. Watching the clouds of smoke float by, I think, how like this pipe am I." Bach's life in Cothen was happy, and he appreciated the prince, who was genuinely interested in and informed about music. But all that changed in 1721, when Leopold took a wife. She was a demanding spouse, someone Bach called an amusa, or opponent to the muses. She was bored with music and took no interest in a special ode Bach had set to music for her wedding day. The prince soon had little time for music or for his friend Bach, and Bach felt neglected. When he found himself playing less and less an important role at court, he once again set out to find a new position elsewhere. This time he found one in Leipzig, where he was appointed choir leader and music director at St. Thomas School, which provided the music and singers for the churches in the area. It was a very prestigious post that put Bach basically in charge of the music for the entire city. In Leipzig, Bach produced a large number of cantatas, sometimes at the rate of one a week. As a devout Lutheran, Bach's work often reflected a strongly religious or spiritual theme, even when it was not written for religious purposes. He wrote INJ on many of his compositions, the Latin abbreviation for "in the name of Jesus," even when those works were non-religious. To Bach, music was a form of worship. Bach remained at this post for the rest of his life, and it's here that he wrote many of his masterpieces. He also continued performing and impressing audiences with his virtuoso organ playing. In his life, Bach played for worshipers, for his family, for students, for other professional musicians, for princes, and for dukes and for kings. In 1747, he was invited to play before Frederick the Great of Prussia at Potsdam. By now, Bach's reputation as a teacher was well established, and students flocked to him from all over the country. He was said to be a very patient teacher who achieved remarkable results. During his years at Leipzig, Bach was also given several non-musical duties that he deeply resented. Because of this, he began to take absences without leave, going off to play the organ here and there, and taking his sons to the Dresden Opera to hear what he called the pretty tunes. He probably accepted many playing engagements for the money, since he had complained that his income by now was less than he had hoped it would be. With a full house of little Bachs, this was an understandable concern. As usual, friction developed between Bach and his employers, because of his declining interest and for other reasons too. Bach was annoyed that they were admitting boys into the school who lacked musical talent, and he was therefore unable to maintain the quality of the chorus. They also refused to adequately finance the orchestra. Finally, Bach convinced a prominent citizen to intervene and obtain a settlement. No one knows what that settlement was, but from then on, Bach seemed content and able to do what he pleased. When Bach approached the age of 55, he began to have trouble with his eyes, probably aggravated by many years of composing late at night by dim light. At first it seemed to him just as if the light was too low or the ink too weak, but the troubles grew progressively worse until he had to seek medical help. There were 2 operations performed, but neither were successful. It's sometimes believed that these operations, completed without benefit of anesthesia, may have weakened Bach. He had a series of illnesses afterwards and finally died of a stroke in 1750. At the time of his death, he was 65 years old, and he was completely blind. Anna Magdalena survived Bach by 10 years, but she was in difficult financial straits. It's not known why she received no help from her children or stepchildren, but it is known that when she died, she was given a pauper's funeral. The amount of music Bach produced in his 65 years is phenomenal. Years later, a great fan of Bach's, Ludwig van Beethoven, would complain that Bach had not been well named. He said he should have been named Meer, which means ocean, rather than Bach, which means brook. For, said Beethoven, no one ever accomplished such an enormous amount of work. Because of his many duties, Bach was required to write music of all different kinds: organ and choral music for the church, chamber music for the court, and harpsichord music for teaching his students and children. Besides these many and varied duties, he found the time to explore his own musical interests in personal compositions, most of which were not performed in his lifetime. Yet it's these private experiments and expressions that now rank among the greatest of the Baroque period. At the beginning of his career, Bach's work drew on the foundations laid by previous Baroque composers, but he soon developed his own distinctive style. It included a greater use of counterpoint, a sense of passion, and a masterful sense of structure. In the last years of his life, his work grew progressively more complex. A large body of his work is the cantatas, of which he wrote more than 200. A cantata is a long, usually religious work for chorus and orchestra. Bach's cantatas were often written around allegorical or mythological themes. Many of his cantatas, and some of his finest organ work, was written in the period he was at Weimar, working under the patronage of the Duke. 2 famous pieces from that period are Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Bach also wrote spectacular passion settings. In music, a passion is a representation of Christ's suffering or crucifixion. Bach wrote 5 passions, but only 2 survived: the Passion according to St. John and the Passion according to St. Matthew. Both demonstrate his great ability to tell a dramatic story without benefit of stage or settings. His other famous sacred works are the Easter and Christmas oratorios and the Mass in B minor. An oratorio is a large musical composition for solo voices, chorus, and orchestra, and it usually dramatizes a sacred story. A Mass is exactly what it sounds like. It's part of the church Mass, or liturgy, set to music. One of Bach's most beloved pieces is the Mass in B minor. Not all of Bach's music was specifically religious. In other non-religious music, Bach's love for the keyboard rose to the surface. There are many organ and harpsichord works that range from the very simple to the most complex. The two most famous of these are the Well-Tempered Clavier, which was written in 2 sections, 22 years apart. Each section has 24 preludes and fugues, written in each of the 12 major and minor keys. The other famous keyboard piece is his Goldberg Variations. The latter were written for an insomniac count who wanted music that would help him sleep. The insomniac count, apparently cured, later sent Bach the largest payment he ever received. There were many instruments that inspired Bach. He wrote special pieces for the cello, violin, lute, viola, flute, harpsichord, and oboe. For chamber orchestra, he wrote the well-known Brandenburg Concertos and 4 extended suites. The Brandenburg Concertos were written and performed in hopes they would land him a position with a court official in Brandenburg. The Brandenburg Concertos did not land Bach the job he was after, but today they're among the most famous instrumental works of the entire Baroque period. In his own time, people found Bach's work too elaborate and preferred music that was simpler and livelier. Although he was appreciated as an organist, the grandness of his compositions would not be realized until the next century, when the composer Felix Mendelssohn revived Bach's Passion according to St. Matthew. Bach's complete works fill 60 volumes, and yet only 9 or 10 were published while he was still alive. Besides working in almost all the musical genres of his time, Bach also blended the different national styles of the 1700s, including French, Italian, English, and German. His music combined an intellectual mastery with exquisite melodies, and although his music can be ornate, it's never showy and strives instead for deeper meaning. Today, Bach's music is still widely performed, and there's a growing interest in performing it the way it was done in his own time. That means the use of small ensembles rather than large choral ensembles, and the use of instruments that are constructed just as they were in the 1700s. There are special Bach festivals held in Europe annually, and concerts of his work still draw large, enthusiastic crowds. It's possible that someday he may even have fans on other planets. When the spaceship Voyager was launched into space in 1977, it carried several items that represented the best and most beautiful of what Earth had to offer. There were copies of our greatest works of art, colorful pictures of people from around the world, the haunting calls of whales in the sea, minerals and gemstones, and photographs of our mountains and forests. There were also recordings of the music of some of our greatest composers, including 3 selections from Johann Sebastian Bach. For 50 years after he died, Bach's music was completely ignored. By then, people were more interested in the new composers, Haydn and Mozart, who, along with Beethoven, had been heavily influenced by Bach, but had created an entirely new sound to classical music. With all this fresh innovation taking place, it was difficult for people to summon interest in a composer who was considered old-fashioned even in his own lifetime. Now, 300 years later, we can appreciate that, far from reverting to an old familiar style, Bach took that style and brought it to its perfection. To Johann Sebastian Bach, music was a form of worship. It offered a very practical way, as a Christian, to serve his fellow man. Through his compositions and his playing, he was able to serve the church and its worshippers, the public, the city, and his patron. He also wrote music to serve his children and his students. He adapted his style and technique to whatever the given need. Bach didn't think in terms of fame or posterity. He saw himself instead as a professional, a craftsman making a living by serving his community's needs for beauty. The result was a large body of work that seems to offer something for everyone: delight to the casual listener, instruction to the professional musician, and inspiration to the devout. He was in many ways a true Christian, pious, tender and big-hearted, and modest. He once said, "I have had to work hard. Anyone who works just as hard will get just as far." He may be right, but in all the history of music, no one has quite yet produced so much nor gotten as far as Johann Sebastian Bach.